This is another set of slides that focuses on just one chapter of Rousseau's work, but again, it's a vitally important chapter. Let's pick up with where we left off last time. We'd said that a small state can have a proportionately larger and therefore weaker government than a large state. The larger the population grows, however, the stronger the government needs to be, and so the government proportionately needs to be smaller. We'd also noted that this inverse relationship between the size of the state and the size of the government poses a serious challenge. Let's examine why that is. Remember that a magistrate or governor is simply an individual person who's a member of the governing body. Rousseau tells us that each magistrate or governor has 3 wills. He says, "We can distinguish in the person of the magistrate 3 essentially different wills. First, the individual's own will, which tends only to its own advantage. Second, the common will of the magistrates, which is uniquely related to the advantage of the prince. This latter can be called the corporate will, and is general in relation to the government, and particular in relation to the state, of which the government forms a part. Third, the will of the people or the sovereign will, which is general both in relation to the state considered as the whole, and in relation to the government considered as a part of the whole." Let's parse that. Unsurprisingly, there are the 2 wills we're already familiar with. The general will, which is the will of the sovereign, that is, the entire people gathered to make law, and the particular, private, or individual will. The corporate will, the will of the whole governing body, is general in relation to the government and particular in relation to the state. If that description rings a bell, it's because Rousseau used similar language when discussing partial societies or factions. Now we can consider why the inverse relationship between the size of the state and the appropriate relative size of the government poses a challenge. It's important to note what Rousseau says in our current chapter about how engaged we tend to be with each will. He says, "These various wills become more active in proportion as they are the more concentrated. Thus the general will is always the weakest, the corporate will has second place, and the private will is first of all, so that in the government each member is first himself, then a magistrate, and then a citizen, a gradation directly opposite to the one required by the social order." Now, recall how we determine what the general will is. We make sure that, when it comes time to vote, members of the assembly vote individually, not in blocks, and they vote with the common good in mind. When that happens, we can trust that the resulting majority reflects the general will. Now let's take a look at the corporate will, that is, the will of the government, in relation to the general will. In this diagram, I've outlined the members of the government in red. The general will is represented by the plus sign here, as is the corporate will. Since we're looking at a small state in this particular example, you'll note that the government is large relative to the size of the population. For the sake of illustration here, I've made it over 50% of the population, though it's unlikely to ever actually be that high a percentage. In a large state, we see the potential problem more acutely. In this example, the corporate will and the general will differ. You'll also note that the number of people in the government is a much smaller percentage of the whole than was the case in a small state. Will the corporate will necessarily reflect the general will in a small state? No, but it's more likely to be the case than in a large state. Will the corporate will necessarily differ from the general will in a large state? No, but it's more likely to differ than it is in a small state. Recall, too, that the private, particular, or individual will is more likely to differ from the general will in a larger state for reasons that we discussed earlier. That's precisely why a larger state needs a stronger government. In a larger state, it's more likely that people will have to be forced to be free, and we need a strong government to do that. But a stronger government is a smaller government. And hopefully you see the tension here. The larger the state, the more likely it is that private wills will differ from the general will, so a strong government will be necessary. But a stronger government is a smaller government, and the smaller the government, the more likely it is that the corporate will differ from the general will. That fact raises another challenge. When individual persons follow the particular will instead of the general will, the government can use its power to force them to be free. But what do we do about a government whose corporate will differs from the general will? We'll consider that question in the next set of slides.